Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Radicals, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. Last week we covered the first few years of the War on Terror and a few characters such as Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. Today we will go over the capture of Hussein and then do a bit of a deep dive into the Enhanced Interrogation program and the people involved in it. So, let's get into it. We'll start today's episode by going over the capture of Saddam Hussein. Saddam spent the majority of 2003 on the run, essentially 9 months of it. Now, things began to go south for him in March of 2003 when the United States led an invasion force into Iraq to bring an end to his government after about 20 years of rule. We went over a bit of Saddam's history in the last episode, but I'll do a bit of a quick refresh here. He was born to a poor, fatherless family of 2 in Tikrit, Iraq, and from these humble beginnings, he would go on to participate in several coups, resulting in his cousin becoming dictator in 1968. Now, 11 years later, in 1979, Saddam would take over this office and become the dictator. And he ruled from then until his capture. And it should go without saying that this rule was not a good one. Saddam had a secret police that terrorized the citizens of Iraq, he committed numerous human rights violations, and his nation lived in relative poverty for the duration of his rule. Now, back to his capture. After the U.S. assault of Iraq began in March, it only took until July of 2003 for the U.S. to go into full search mode for 55 of the regime's most wanted members. Obviously, Hussein was at the top of this list. After about 5 months, in December, soldiers found Saddam hiding in a 6 to 8 foot deep hole about 9 miles outside of his hometown of Tikrit. He was taken without resistance and described as, quote, a man resigned to his fate. Hussein would stand trial and was executed in December of 2006, thus bringing to close an extremely long and brutal regime in Iraq. Now we'll cover a couple more events of 2003 before moving forward. In May of 2003, Bush delivered a speech from the USS Abraham Lincoln stating, quote, mission accomplished, and that major combat efforts for the war in Iraq will end. This was quickly followed up by, the Battle of Iraq is one victory in a war on terror. So Bush was clearly not ready to resign, any wariness or anything like that. He was still very dedicated to the war on terror, even though things were seemingly solved in Iraq. Later, on August 23rd, 23 people, including 2 UN officials, were killed, and 100 people were wounded when a suicide bomber drove a truck into the UN headquarters in Baghdad. This event marked the first suicide bombing in Iraq since the US takeover, and it was also a relatively pointless attack since the UN had no official hand in the US-led invasion of Iraq. And that's really about all the excitement for 2003, so we'll move into 2004, beginning with the large Islamic extremist attack in Spain, killing about 190 people. On March 11th, 2004, nearly 2,000 people were injured when a combined 10 bombs exploded on 4 trains in Madrid. These bombs went off during the morning rush hour and were later discovered to be detonated from phones. Immediately after, blame was being thrown at a separatist militant group in Spain, but it was quickly discovered that a militant Islamist group tied to Al-Qaeda was at fault. At least 3 bombs never detonated and were later found intact by investigators. This attack marked the deadliest civilian attack on European soil since the 1998 Lockerbie airplane bombing. Meanwhile, the war, or now more of an occupation, continued in Iraq. The country was attempting to pull itself back together after years of the former regime, but there were claims of election fraud and the transition of power was anything but smooth. The country also continued to suffer random terror attacks, killing hundreds of civilians. It's hard to parse out exactly what the US was attempting to do there at the time, but I imagine stabilization or some other similar vocabulary would be involved. So we're going to take a bit of a break from the war, and I want to shift scope and discuss what I guess will be the primary topic for today's episode, and that would be the enhanced interrogation methods and how they were used in the early 2000s. It would appear that the road to legalized torture began just 6 days after the 9/11 attacks, when President Bush signed a classified covert action memorandum authorizing the CIA to detain terrorists. Things got worse in February of 2002 when Bush signed another memorandum stating that the Geneva Conventions did not apply to the global conflict with Al-Qaeda. The Geneva Conventions were a set of articles put together by the UN to regulate human rights and hopefully stop practices like torturing POWs and using gases in combat. And the first POW in the War on Terror was taken in March of 2002. So already it would seem that Bush has classified terrorists as non-human. Now this first POW's name was Abu Zubaydah, and he was captured in Pakistan and transferred to CIA custody to be interrogated jointly by the FBI and CIA officers. He was then placed in isolation for 47 days, and the FBI actually never returned. Now, on August 22nd, the Justice Department issued 2 memorandums concluding that the proposed enhanced interrogation techniques did not violate federal anti-torture statutes. These techniques not in violation included waterboarding, walling or throwing a prisoner against a wall, sleep deprivation, standing on broken feet, solitary confinement, stress positions, rectal feeding and rectal exams, or forcing pureed food up a prisoner's anal cavity, nudity, threats to families, and a plethora of other things. And I don't even know where to begin with this list of non-torturous interrogation techniques. To the normal ear, all of these sound like torture to some extent, but unfortunately for everyone, the US government did not agree, and these techniques would go on to be used on many prisoners of the War on Terror. Now back to Abu. After 47 days of isolation, Zubaydah was subject to almost constant coercive interrogation techniques, including the first application of waterboarding. And by the end of 2002, 2 more prisoners were subject to the same enhanced interrogation. Throughout 2003, the CIA repeatedly reaffirms the legality of enhanced interrogation techniques and even survives one investigation into them. Now we'll take a brief break to talk about the 2 individuals behind enhanced interrogation. James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen were psychologists hired by the CIA to design the enhanced interrogation program, even though neither had any experience as an interrogator, nor did they have any specialized knowledge of Al-Qaeda or anything involved with the War on Terror. Both men had previously worked for the Air Force Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape SEER School, and this is probably where they gained most of their interrogation knowledge, as SEER School prepares soldiers for any potential circumstances they may find themselves in upon enemy capture. Based on this experience, Mitchell provided a list of 12 SEER techniques that the CIA could use. Those included the majority of those previously listed, along with the attention grasp, the facial hold, the facial slap, and a cramped confinement. All of these were verbally approved by the Attorney General Josh Ashcroft on July 24th, 2002. And both men were paid more than $75 million for their service to the US government before 2009, when the program was officially shut down. So we've talked about what enhanced interrogation was and who was behind it, but what was it actually for? Well, the official explanation is that these techniques were used when a subject held information pertinent to an upcoming terrorist attack. But with over 100 prisoners suffering the consequences of the CIA program and very little usable information actually gained, this precedent seems doubtful. Realistically, psychology does not back up much of the program. Most interrogators know that information is most often gained through relationship building between prisoner and captor, rather than physical and mental degrading. Social scientists have stated that research has found, quote, torture and enhanced interrogation are likely to be less effective than non-coercive interrogation methods in persuading individuals to cooperate, end quote. A body of more than 100 studies of interrogation support this statement. All say that non-coercive methods are almost always more effective than torture. So all in all, what can we make of enhanced interrogation on our nation's history? I mean, it doesn't look great. The Bush administration took the line of terrorists aren't humans when excluding them from his definition of the Geneva Convention, and there are records and reports for roughly 8 years of officials overlooking the questionable side of enhanced interrogation before a very long investigation would bring any of it to light. One prisoner even died as a result of the enhanced interrogation methods, and his body gave in to hypothermia from cold buckets of water being poured on his naked body, while his hands and feet were tied to the same bolt in the floor and hard rock music blasted in his ears. That was a method called hog tying. But yeah, just take a minute to let that sink in. There's a film with Adam Driver called The Report that depicts one of the Senate employees' journeys to uncover the truth of enhanced interrogation, and I would highly recommend it if you want to learn a bit more about all of this. But suffice it to say, no government official really ever paid for this tarnish on our nation's reputation. And the torture report, as it came to be called, was more or less swept under the rug, and the two psychiatrists responsible for the operation made off with millions of taxpayer dollars. So that just about concludes our dive into one of the more despicable programs in the US government during the early 2000s. Although next to some of the other things our country has done, torture really shouldn't surprise anyone too much. Next week we will continue through the end of the first decade of the 2000s and hopefully learn a bit more about the War on Terror. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will talk to you all next time on Radicals, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow.